many years of Langley's prominence as a trading post for fur, salmon, and cranberries, one of the most important sidelights to the Hudson's Bay Company was its farm. It comprised of approximately 2,000 acres, and it produced grain, butter, potatoes, and supported cattle and pigs for shipment to as far away as Russia. The farm reached out from what is now Trinity Western College to the number 10 highway. During the years up to 1858, the farm was incredibly productive. The following 25 years saw various changes, which resulted in the Hudson's Bay Company's decision to cease operation of the farm. The two main factors being the government revoking the exclusive trading rights of the company in 1858, and secondly, Langley becoming a municipality in 1873. By 1884, the Hudson's Bay Company decided it was unprofitable and put the farm, machinery, and cattle on the auction block. The land sold anywhere from $25 to $30 an acre in 100-acre parcels. Two new communities emerged in the transition from company farm to family farms. Murrayville, named after the Murray family, came into being after they homesteaded the area in 1875. It became the center of distribution of goods and services for the new settlers. The other community which we are concerned with is Milner. It is situated in the middle of what was the Hudson's Bay Company farm, and in 1910 it became a commercial center that supplied the needs of the pioneers. Many of the surviving pioneer family members who purchased the Hudson Bay farm, as well as their neighboring homesteaders, remember quite vividly the lifestyles that they lived in Langley not too many years ago. Our family, the Poppies, along with many other Langley pioneers, have a recollection of those homesteading days. What you see out behind me was not always like this. It was always heavy timber, and this had to be disposed of so that crops could be planted. And the only way to dispose of it was cut them into lengths and split them and burn them. And of course, this required family teamwork. The mother would look after the chores around the house and the barn, and Dad would do the clearing, and probably working out a little bit to get a little bit of money to buy things that was necessary. And the chores when we were small was getting the water from the well about a couple of 100 feet away, and the wood from the woodshed for the stove, which was used for cooking and heating, and particularly heating in the wintertime. And I don't know why it is, but as youngsters, it seemed to be that the wood box was always empty and the pail was always dry. And off we'd have to go for this water. And sometimes visitors would come, and if we just didn't have enough meat for them, we'd go out and kill the chicken, and we'd have stewed chicken or roast chicken. And everybody was always welcome, because this was part of the creed of those days. Your neighbors were always welcome. We had all our own vegetables, of course, so they didn't have to be purchased. In fact, you couldn't purchase them because there was no place to get them. However, this left many happy memories in my mind as a youngster for those bygone days. The Andersons of Murrayville, a homesteading family of long standing. Benny Anderson's father owned and operated the Murrayville blacksmith shop and garage for many years.
Our home was right where this lovely home is here now, but our home was only 3 rooms downstairs and 2 bedrooms upstairs. And on the back here was a lean-to, which we kept all the wood for the winter time. After my father had built the new front on here, then the blacksmith shop was moved back here to this corner here, where he had the forge and did the horseshoeing through this door. Took the horses in through this door here.
The McDonalds, a family of the same area, owned the sawmill producing lumber for housing. Grace Atchison, a daughter of the McDonalds, has her recollections.
The sleigh rides. I remember the sleigh rides that we had. It deep snow, you know, in those days, and it lasted for weeks. And my father had a lovely big team for the logging, you know, and hitched them onto that big bobsleigh and gather up the neighbors and go in for sleigh rides at night. Oh, that was a real thrill when we were little kids.
Velma Kerr, formerly Velma Smith, a milliner, has her memories of family life in the Milner Center.
Lots of good times as well as hard times. I know it was hard for my parents because there was lots of hard work and not the machinery that there is on the farms these days. But they didn't complain. They had good times too. We lived close enough to the center of Milner where there was a good hall for dancing and lots of good times. And if people needed help, all I had to do was ask. The neighbors were great for helping one another.
Addie Toll's father and mother were one of the first pioneers on the Hudson's Bay farm that was auctioned off in the 1880s.
As I say, it was in September. There was stacks of watermelon. Great, they would fill an ordinary truck van. Well, let's stop and get a watermelon. So my wife said, well, yeah, but don't get too big a one. So I got up and went over to the guy and I says, how much do you want for the watermelon? 10 cents for your choice. You couldn't get watermelon that price today.
No.
So we had our choice of watermelon, not too big a one though, but boy, I often wish we could go and get them at that price today.
Mrs. Odell spent many years in the Milner area when it was a center for banking, shopping, and just sitting around talking about anything under the sun.
The church, as it still stands, and of course there was, with the church, there was a long shed for the people who drove their horse and buggies to church, and the parsonage on there. And right across the road was the little old one-room pink run-down school that I attended. That was all right in Milner up till 1909 or 10.
There were many families who lived further out from the Milner and Murrayville centers, families that worked hard and long hours to clear and upgrade their land. Bob Thompson's family was one of these. His father built many of the houses in the South Langley area, a good 3-hour wagon ride or walk to Murrayville.
You had to have cows and horses and pigs and chickens and so forth, you know, and you grew stuff that was suitable for that. And you sold, like butter, you trade your butter and eggs in, you know, for your groceries, a lot of them. We had to go to the Langley, out to Murrayville, to a big store at Murrayville at that time, and we used to have to go out there and take our stuff out. We'd go out maybe once a week with either a team or a buggy or something.
These and many other pioneering family members can tell us their history. These longtime citizens of Langley are the sons and daughters of the original settlers, but they still remember how their mothers and fathers came to Langley.
My dad came from New Brunswick, and my mother came from Scotland. You know where that is. Yeah. Yeah, they come across Canada and down in through by the States, and they come up from San Francisco in a boat. And they landed at what they called Moodyville. My father came here when he was 9 years old, and I don't know how old my mother was, but a few years after that, where they showed up here. the whole Stoddart family.
My father came from Simcoe, Ontario. He was a carriage builder and blacksmith by trade. He landed at the 150-mile house, and he shod the stagecoach horses and the pack trains that came through there for a couple of years. And then he decided to go to the bullion mine. There he shrunk the iron bands on wooden boxes that they shipped the gold bricks out to the stagecoach. He then left there and came down here to Langley, and he and his father purchased the farm up there on the hill when they first came here, where the old Cummings estate. And then they left that, and he came down here and worked for the Monahan brothers. At that time, this building here was this was an L-shaped building like you see now, but only about a third of the size. And that the back end was two-story like you see now. And in the early days, they used that top over there to play basketball in. It was a community effort, and they used that upstairs to to play basketball. In later years, the Monahans lived up there. The Westminster Trust had a mortgage on the place at that time, and things had got pretty rough, and the Monahans lost it. And my father moved down to Fort Langley, at which time the community of Murrayville put on a little going-away party for him. They presented him with a purse with $28 in it. And he went down to Fort Langley and worked in the blacksmith shop at Fort Langley for 2 weeks. Westminster Trust came out to see him and persuaded him to take over the mortgage and come back to Murrayville, which he did. And he operated as a blacksmith shop, and he did a lot of repairs on the wagons and setting tires and things like this. And then in later years, when the Model Ts came in, he decided to pull the front of this off and build it as you see it is today.
Dad came to Canada in 1884 and worked on the CPR on the CPR right away as a surveyor. Not an actual surveyor, but he worked with a survey crew and helped to stake out many of the town sites on the prairie, Medicine Hat, and so on. He tells the story of the Indians lifting all the stakes in Medicine Hat and using them for firewood. And then the end of steel from the east to west was at Banff. And that was as far as he worked there. And being very impatient, I guess, and trying to get out to see what was on the west coast, the end of steel from west to east was at Spence's Bridge. So he and another fellow couldn't wait any longer, so they walked from Banff to Spence's Bridge and then down to Vancouver. And then he worked on the island until had a contract or two in Vancouver, grading streets. And he was in Vancouver at the time of the big fire in 1886, in June, I think it was. And then luckily he was paid for the contract, because after the fire, there was so much rotten wood in them that the streets, they couldn't find them. There's only a sea of stumps. However, in September of '86, he decided he would like a homestead somewhere in the Fraser Valley. So he and another fellow by the name of Melrose walked out from Westminster and preempted this property here, and his partner preempted the quarter to the south. And that was the start of the Poppy family in Langley in September of '86.
My father was born in Scotland, and he came to Canada when he was 14 to Burke's Falls, Ontario, and through his family were. And my mother and her father and her mother were born in Prince Edward Island. From my father's family, there were 5 boys and 1 girl, and the boys came out and went into the mill business in BC. So that my father and one of his brothers, his brother was the engineer and my father was the sawyer. in all the mills along the valley until he got money enough to build a mill for himself.
Well, my father was born in Prince Edward Island, and my mother was born in Ontario, and they both came with their parents to BC when they were 12 years old and went to school in Langley, and that's how they met in the first place. They lived in Vancouver for the first 3 or 4 years that they were married, and then came to Langley to farm.
My father was born in Cornwall, England, and he came out when he was 4 years old to Ontario. Was there till he was 14. And then they moved to Nanaimo. My grandfather was a miner in the old country, and they went there for the coal mine. My mother was born in Chatham, Ontario, and I think came out on one of the first trains across, you know, when the CPR went through. And they settled in what well, it still is Lula Island, but it was just a farm land when they were settled there.
These determined, hardy people came to an area that has little resemblance to the landscape which we have today. Land had to be cleared, and this was an arduous task. When he first come here, the property, I don't know, they must have had quite an ambition, because it was just a sea of huge logs and stumps and snags, and you name it. Probably the second growth brush wasn't all that heavy, but this is the result of the dead timber was the result of a fire that come through here in about 1840 and just devastated the whole country. A very good comparison for the original timber here would be equal to the Cathedral Grove on Vancouver Island. I can remember huge cedar stumps where the timber was cut into, what was left was cut into shingle bolts and sold to the mill about 1910, 12, 14 in there. Usually the big old logs were cut into lengths and split and then piled up and burned in the fall. And this was quite a task. And probably you had to work like anything to claim about 1 acre to 2 acres a year in this, where this heavy clearing was. If you could average 1 acre a year, it was quite good. And of course you took the easy spots first, and the real bad places, like little areas here that had more timber, you would leave that and then clear the outside.
And then they sold the timber off. You see, that was the first thing they started to do. They started to sell this timber off. It was all on the land here. These big cedar trees. There was on the other side of the creek there was great big cedars and firs there. Some of them firs there were 6 foot through, you know. And
how tall would they be?
Oh, I don't know. 300 feet, I guess, 200 feet, 300 feet. They're big ones. It's good timber in the valley here. It's good timber in the valley.
Yeah.
It was low land, but it was all logged off, of course, with horses and things like that. They left half it in the woods.
Back. Back up. Back up. Back. Back up, do. Ho. Stand.
Easy, do. Easy.
Schooling in the early part of the century was not quite what we have today. Many hours were spent walking to school to share a single classroom with other students from ages 6 to 15. Furthering your education to high school meant having to live with other family members in New Westminster or Vancouver.
Well, as I say, I started in school at 5 years old. And the first year, I stayed with my aunt that was a little bit on a mile from east of here. Mother was away a lot of the time, so I made my home with my aunt. Because my aunt could go from there to school, I can go from here to school, you see. But I had to walk all up that road all by myself, in the timber, all big timber. And once in a while, you'd see something come down that big hill there, and on one day, there was an old, about a half-grown bear sitting on the side of the road scratching himself.
If we had a teacher that could handle us, we were as good as gold. But if we didn't, woe be on to that one. Well, one teacher was an English kindergarten teacher. Now put an English kindergarten teacher in among a bunch of tough country kids, everywhere age up to 17. And we just run that poor kindergarten teacher ragged. As a group, we were trying to be clannish, and a new youngster that came into that school went through hell for a little while. And if that youngster sort of took it all on the chin, he was accepted. But if he didn't, he lived a miserable life for a time. There very seldom we had new ones come in. But that was the older members were, well, that was our school. You behave like us or you don't belong.
This is the school I attended from grade 1 to grade 8. It was then called Belmont School. It's now called Murrayville School. These oak trees here were about 5 feet high at that time, and there was a stone wall fence all along the front here. The municipal hall was right over there. This basement room on the left was the boys' playroom, and the one on the right was the girls'. At that time it was wood construction, and there was windows all along the end and along the sides so that it would be light in the basement. When the bell would ring, we'd all line up at the steps here in twos, the girls on the right and the boys on the left. And the girls were always called in first in those days, and the boys followed to our individual classrooms. Just inside the door here was the boys' and girls' cloakrooms. These rooms were divided then in half the size they are now, and the teacher's office was in the far end of each room. This school had 4 classrooms. The beginners started down here on my right, and then you advanced here over here to the second room here for your grades 3 and 4. This room here was 5 and 6, and this room here where I finished off in was 7 and 8.
The first 2 years walking to school when I was only 6 to water, 3 miles, mud road, no pavement, and that was really hard. But I still remember it, but I think it toughened me up. I don't get many colds now, so.
This is the classroom I attended grade 7 and 8, and I used to sit right over here near the back, in the back seat, and this about right here. And Helen Lee, and in fact the matter is the Lee family were pioneers of Langley, and I'm sure that all the Lee family attended school here. Helen used to sit in front of me, and when at exam time, she was a very bright student, and at exam time when I was having problems, I would poke her in the back and ask her to give me the answer to the question, so she'd write it down on a little slip of paper and pass it back to me.
I think the teachers in those days, and our parents, we went to school to get an education and not much fooling around. So we tried to get as much as we could for the least time. So that would be the main purpose in those days.
No extras like sewing or cooking or...
Yeah.
Yeah.
The social fabric of the community in those pioneering days was held together by the common problems and aspirations of the people.
All the old-timers that come in here and homesteaded, they were pretty tough, you know. They came from all over the world, you know. There was English, Irish, Scotch, German, French, everything you name it, they're going to have it, you know. And everybody, there was no trouble between the different nations those days. They're all the same. They're all in the same boat. It's the same as it was during the Depression, you see. You forget all those things when you got some other trouble to bother you, see. That's the thing. You get along with one another pretty good.
Yes, we visited more. We would go spend, you never just went for a cup of tea. You went for a meal and sat down at the table with the others. And to say, we'd have music, if people that played music and so on. We had a very good community spirit. We had to have. That was our entertainment, really.
I think in those days, I think we, as neighbors, we were dependent on each other.
Yes.
And we had to be. And now people seem to be all on their own. It's a complete different era. And this is one of the things that I'm sorry to see go. Quilting bees for the women, logging bees and thrashing bees for the men, and barn raisings. And this country was built and developed by neighbors helping each other. The church was a center of most communities. It also provided a place for the settlers to congregate for quilting bees, Sunday school, and other social gatherings.
I think most every community had a church, and they had their social work, you know. Can't remember that it was much different what they do now, but the ladies would have meetings, afternoon meetings and things like that. We had young people's groups in our church at Milner, and it was just a part of the community activity.
One at Murrayville, one at Fort Langley, and one here well, they were Presbyterian and Methodist. This was a Methodist church, and Fort Langley was a Presbyterian. And then there was an Anglican church up the road about a mile up here, and eventually it was closed, I guess, and they moved it up next to Bill Poppy's.
That's our church in Otter now.
Yeah, up in Otter. They moved it from there up. Not by oxen, I guess by...
Oh, it was all taken apart.
Taken apart, I guess, yeah.
Some of it was hauled up with team and wagon. I think our team and wagon hauled it up.
There was an uncle of mine who lived in Westminster. He gave them a price, I think it was $975 to build it. Now I guess he did the work, and they supplied the lumber, brought the lumber in from the mills all around the country. Well, the service would last an hour and a half, depend how long-winded the minister was. Isn't that right, Bill?
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is a little church that my mother and father attended. My mother played the organ and my father sang in the choir. And my sister and I attended Sunday school here. This was a must, that we attend Sunday school every Sunday. There was a couple here, they had no family, and he was kind of a fussy chap, name of Uncle Davy Lamb. If the sermon got a little long, he'd look at his watch a couple of times, and if the preacher didn't pay any attention, he would tap his cane on the floor to warn the preacher that it was time to go home for lunch. We also held, in the community hall up here, we held whist drives and had box socials. And if there was one particular box that you'd like to buy, and you found out who made it, and you were anxious to buy it, you'd pay a pretty good price for it.
Communities of those years had a number of gathering places. The churches, as we have mentioned, the general stores, banks, community centers, and blacksmith shops. They provided to the community all the basic goods and services with which the pioneers needed to carry on their daily lifestyle. These buildings were a natural for adults and children alike to pursue friendships and learn of life. There was a bank in Milner, I think, well, I don't think, I'm sure there was a bank here before there was a bank any other place in Langley.
That was the Bank of Hamilton.
And then, if I recall, the Bank of Vancouver.
Yeah.
And then the Royal had a branch here until they built their first bank in Langley.
Yeah.
And the blacksmith shop.
Yeah.
Where was that?
Straight across the road here.
And that was a little...
Right next to where the hall is there now, or the store is.
And that's the place where all the stories were swapped. And
oh, yeah, they swapped a lot of good stories in there.
One person probably tried to outdo the other, I imagine.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I would be in there with both feet.
You would now, that's for sure. Well, I don't think your dad, I think you come by it honestly.
The blacksmith shop. That was a great old hangout.
They usually are, because in those days you had to bring your horses to get shoes on. And it took a little time, so somebody else would come along, so there you could always, we call it shooting the breeze, but I think in those days they had their visits and
oh, yeah.
a bit of fun and so on.
Yeah. And then Buckerfields had a shed there. Then there was a blacksmith shop that was right almost next to the school. It was lovely for us school youngsters. He used to let us come over and we'd slip out of the school fence and watch him shoe the horses. But a very well liked man is George Moyer. Everybody liked him. Plenty hard for us to understand because he was, well, very Scotch.
On my left here was the old Cummings house, and the butcher shop was there. The old store, which is long gone, was in here. It was an L-shaped building, two-story building. Mr. Porter, I believe, bought it from a man by the name of Mr. Whitten during the First World War. It was very heavily stocked with dry goods, bolts of cloth, and hardware. You name it, they had it.
Mr. Cummings had the butcher shop across the street, and they didn't have the refrigeration, you know, so he just had a screen door on the front of the butcher shop because he had beef and pork hanging up, you know, and he had to have a cold place for it. So he used to come over every morning, and between the two of us, that was a big store then. It's not like it is now. It's cut down but it was a big, long building. And they had a barrel, sort of a stove, that took big logs for fuel. So Mr. Cummings and I used to try to stoke up, you know. And he'd come over there just freezing, real cold weather. So the two of us, I always say, nearly froze to death. But we had a lot of fun, we didn't mind. Yes, I was there for 7 years in that store.
This was the house I was born in 1906. The part behind me was the original log house that Dad built in 1888. The other part was added to it in 1904. This housed our family, mother and dad, my brother and sister, who are still living in this house and are still enjoying reasonably good health. The upstairs comprised of 3 bedrooms with 1 bedroom downstairs. In the original house, we had a post office there from 1896 until about 1927. And there were no post offices in the area, and people come in for miles and miles around to get their mail once a week. And many a good visit we had with friends and neighbors once a week on the porch. The house wasn't complete unless it had a porch.
That's right.
And it was the porch was used for various purposes. I think ours was used to relaxation and to store the vegetables in the fall until they ripened properly.
We used to spend quite a bit of time on the porch in the summer evenings when there weren't any mosquitoes. We used to have terrible mosquitoes, didn't we?
And we had a hammock, the same as that one there. That was nice for summertime on the porch.
Well, I think about once a month, anybody that had a big house used to gather the people together for a surprise party. They'd take all the lunch with them, you know, to a certain house. And they had square dancing and always brought a fiddler along. Jack Livingston was the fiddler.
Yeah.
That was in the evening. Hmm? That was in the evening more than the daytime.
Yes, in the evening. Well, I guess it was the winter months mostly that they had these surprise parties. There was no other entertainment. They made their fun then, square dancing and move all the furniture out of the dining room and have square dancing. And we were just little kids.
But you joined in.
No, we didn't. We were sent to bed, and we used to come down and sit on the stairs to listen to the music, you know. I can remember that.
Neighbors were your lifeline back in those days. Without each other to depend on, not an awful lot would have been accomplished. There was a sharing of labor at thrashing bees, barn raisings, and many other heavy chores. Even in sickness, your neighbor was the doctor, because the real doctor was many hours away.
And these kids used to get that cholera phantom, and mother to bring them here, you know. Come in over these bad roads and everything else and bring them kids here sometimes in the middle of the night. And she'd get up there and she'd feed them. She never lost one. They never had one die. And I know lots of them around. There's some of them you could see through their hands, you know. You could see the bones in their hands, their little hands, you know. So, consequently, she was kept busy. And they'd come and get her lots of times in the middle of the night to go someplace, you know, maybe to Fort Langley or someplace like that. Oh, gosh, lots of times I'd have to get up out of here and get the old horse and ride horseback out to where there was a telephone to get the doctor or something. Old Dr. Marr used to be at Fort Langley at that time. And he had he had 2 teams of real fast horses, you know, and he had them in a light buggy. And God, he'd come in here, boy, and the teams would be just sweating when they got here. The times was different to what they are now, you know. Another doctor in Blaine at that time, Dr. Sutherland, he used to come in here once in a while. He'd come up along and do through, there was a trail through here, kind of a rough trip through there, and he used to come in over that, you know.
Yeah.
But we did cooperate with the neighbors, what they called logging bees or clearing bees, where half a dozen neighbors would get together and take 1 or 2 days at each place. And this accomplished quite a little bit because many people piling logs for burning and so on. It was a cooperative effort, and hard work went much easier in these days. So and food, talk about food, the wives would, various places, the various houses, I think one would try to outdo the other. So you could have the most and the bestest, particularly pie and meats and vegetables and things like this. And this is one of the things that I, as a senior citizen, now I miss very, very much, is this cooperative effort with people. It's one of the things that I think it built this country, and I think it would help a lot more now if we could have this cooperation at the present time.
A stable family life, a productive farm, and a comfortable home were the major goals of the pioneers in those early days. Everyone worked. The children helped with the chores, father with the farm, and mother keeping the house in order.
Your dad was quite an artisan, aren't you?
Oh, God, yeah. He was a great carpenter, yeah. Old-fashioned. He wouldn't get to first base today, you know. You know, today it's all machinery, you know. Everything's done. You can build a house today, and, you know, he was 3 years building this thing. Of course, he was doing chores in between times. He had to look after the farm, you know, and everything. Oh, well, of course, when we were working out in the woods, it was 10 hours a day, 6 days a week those days. If you got $3 a day, you were pretty lucky. You had to be one of the important guys, you know, if you got $3 a day.
Oh, well, I know my parents worked very hard. Mother cooked for 14 men, the mill crew, as well as having 8 children. So, you know, it was hard work. And no conveniences. You know, no water in the house and no plumbing in the house. It was quite different than now. So they had hard times, but I was so young, I didn't realize that then. My 2 oldest brothers, they worked in the mill before too many years. And my sisters, too, worked hard. They were older than I was. And they helped Mother in the house, too.
On the farm in those days, they had no electric machines or vacuum cleaners or anything like that. And it was, I can still see my mother scrubbing over a scrub board. And it must have been horrible with the heavy clothes, the heavy overalls, etc. of the men. It must have been terribly hard work. And on the other hand, dressed, I guess maybe she was glad she had only 1 girl out of 5. And all the ironing, these starts, petticoats, and all the rest of it that they had, it was no easy work. And apart from that, she helped in the barn, she helped milking, do the milking. And when we were back on this place on the Nickel-Nackle, my mother and my uncle made butter. They said they made several hundred pounds of butter a week. They all lived. And living on the Nickel-Nackle, that was a cooler, and it was taken into New Westminster, where it was traded for food and clothing and so on. There was practically no money. Mm-hmm. So Mother knew what work was, and she was a very, very hard worker and a good worker, and never complained about her work, which sometimes I wondered why. The house was built by inches, as it were, and when we did move there, after 7 years, the framework was there. There was only the downstairs partially finished, and it was done inch by inch. The kitchen and pantry was finished, and then the front room. Mm-hmm. And I can remember getting new linoleum for the front room and things like that. It was, well, something to have it built up like that. Right. But it was done as, I suppose, the pennies were there to do it.
It was a hard life, but satisfying as well. The long hours of work left you with a good tiredness, the feeling that you had accomplished something with your time and energy. Especially after harvest, when the neighbors helped. The steam engines were brought in, and you realized another good crop had been successfully harvested. This was our life, the lifestyle of our mothers and fathers, materially much different than today. But has our nature as human beings changed? We still need to feel part of a community and that our neighbor cares. There is much to be learned and kept from the pioneers.
Now you have to get along with people, help people out if you can. And I do a lot of that. Right now I've got a shop at home there and I do more jobs for people. Little job, you know, I don't charge them anything, only just for materials, you know.
Definitely, I don't want to go back to the good old times that they talk about, because they were good, hard times as well as good times. I think we live in a better age.
Younger people are so different today. You know, they don't take to these old. Some of them do, but not very many of them.
It's the friendliness of the people in those days. The people now are so busy with their own lives often that they don't have time to be friends with their neighbors.
That's right.
But I think that's, in some cases, that's the way it is.
Yes, that's quite true.
I think in those days, I think we, as neighbors, we were dependent on each other.
Yes.
And we had to be. And now people seem to be all on their own. It's a complete different era. And this is one of the things that I'm sorry to see go.
The older